It was the summer of 1945, when the desert wind burned against the metal sides of a transport bus, rolling through the endless dust of Arizona. Inside 12 German nurses sat shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms faded, their faces hollow from sleepless nights and hunger. The war had ended for them, but what waited ahead felt no different from punishment. The engine roared like a warning, drowning out their thoughts. None dared to speak. They had been told what captivity in America would be: humiliation, cruelty, revenge. They were ready for that. They thought they were ready for anything. But when the bus slowed and the heavy gates of the prisoner camp came into view, something shifted. Through the narrow windows they saw not guards with whips or shouting crowds, but sunlight spilling over neat fences, a flag rising in the wind, and most jarring of all, the faint smell of food. Not the metallic scent of army rations or the stench of burned coffee substitutes they'd known back home. This was different. Rich, warm, human, bacon, bread, real coffee. The scent cut through the dust and silence like a blade, stirring memories they had buried under months of fear. For a moment, no one moved. Then the door creaked open and light flooded in. Boots hit the ground. The nurses blinked, expecting commands, barked in anger, but instead heard calm voices speaking English, measured and steady. One soldier gestured for them to step forward. Another held the first. Boots hit the gravel hesitantly, one after another, the sound too soft for a place meant to hold prisoners. Dust lifted in small clouds around their ankles. For a moment no one dared to speak. The nurses stood frozen in the heat, blinking against the white sun, their eyes adjusting to a world they didn't recognize. The barbed wire they expected was there, but it glimmered faintly in the morning light, not menacing, just there. Beyond it stood neat rows of barracks, wooden fences, a guard tower, and a flag rippling lazily in the wind. Everything was too clean, too still. No barking dogs, no shouts, no chaos. The calm itself was unnerving. One woman, her hands trembling, pressed them against her skirt to keep them from shaking. Another looked at the guards, young sunburned Americans in khaki uniforms. Their rifles hung loosely at their sides, not raised. They watched, but without hatred. That confused them more than any weapon could. They had imagined something brutal, loud, humiliating. Instead, the silence weighed heavier than fear. A sergeant gestured toward the barracks, speaking slowly, his English clipped and clear. The words were simple, repeated twice, so they'd understand. Follow. No trouble. He didn't spit the words. He didn't sneer. It was as if they were workers being assigned rooms, not enemies being contained. The women exchanged uncertain glances, each waiting for the cruelty that must be coming the moment the mask would drop. None of them moved until one of the guards pointed gently at the path, not in anger, but almost like an usher showing guests where to go. As they began to walk, the gravel crunched beneath their worn boots. The camp stretched wider than they thought, with small trees planted along the paths and a water tower gleaming in the distance. The smell of bread grew stronger with every step. One of the nurses, Erica, felt her stomach twist painfully. Hunger did that to her now. Even the scent of food was an ache. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the faces around her. The guards, the cooks, a few American nurses moving briskly between buildings. The sight of women in uniform startled her. She hadn't expected to see them here. The group was led toward a long wooden building. Inside, the light dimmed. The air was cooler, filled with the faint scent of soap and metal. Rows of bunks lined the walls, each with thin but clean sheets folded neatly at the foot. For a moment, the German nurses didn't move. They stood there like statues, afraid to touch anything, afraid this was a trick. Back home, hospitals had been cold, filthy, starving for supplies. Here, even a prisoner's bed looked like a small luxury. Hilda, the oldest among them, stepped forward. Her voice cracked as she whispered in German, "They treat us like people." No one answered. The others didn't know if she was being grateful or afraid. Gratitude itself felt dangerous, as if feeling it meant betraying their own suffering. An American officer entered, clipboard in hand. He began calling names, reading from a list. His tone was neutral, no contempt, no sympathy. One by one the nurses stepped forward to confirm their identities. Each time a name was said correctly, there was a pause, a flicker of surprise. Back home, their language had been the sound of power. Here, it sounded small. When the roll call ended, the officer nodded and stepped aside. The guards moved closer, not to threaten, but to hand them bundles of folded linen soap and small tin cups. The women stared at the objects in their hands. Real soap. Not the gray, crumbling kind made of ashes and ration grease, but smooth, white, smelling faintly of lavender. Erica clenched hers tightly, half expecting someone to snatch it back. She didn't know why the kindness made her chest hurt more than hunger ever had. There was a strange ache behind her ribs, part relief, part shame. Outside, the camp bell rang, a hollow metallic sound that echoed across the yard. A guard gestured for them to follow again. They were led toward a larger building, and as the door opened, warmth and light spilled out. The smell hit them, first eggs, coffee, toasted bread, the scent of an ordinary breakfast, but to them it felt impossible. They froze in the doorway, unsure if they were even allowed to breathe that air. Inside, soldiers sat at long tables eating. They weren't laughing or shouting. They ate in quiet conversation, the hum of voices calm and steady. A cook behind the counter looked up and said something to the guard, who replied with a nod. Then, without ceremony, metal trays were placed on the counter, one for each woman. They hesitated. The guard pointed again, patient, then stepped aside. Slowly they moved forward. Food was ladled onto their trays, bread, beans, a scoop of scrambled eggs. No one said a word. When they sat down, the benches creaked beneath them. Their hands hovered over the plates. No one touched the food at first. It felt like a test, some cruel trick to see who would break. But hunger is stronger than fear. One nurse took a small bite, then another. Soon the sound of quiet eating filled the room. Tears welled in more than one pair of eyes, though no one cried aloud. Erica looked around, trying to understand. The guards stood by the door, watchful but calm. Across the room, she noticed an American nurse pouring coffee. Her skin was dark, her movements efficient, composed. The Germans watched in silence, remembering every lie they had been told about people like her. About inferiority, about who should serve and who should rule. Yet here she was, moving with quiet authority, respected by the men around her. The contradictions pressed like weights on their chests. When the coffee reached their table, the American nurse stopped. She looked at them, not unkindly, and asked simply, "You want her?" English was sharp but polite. No sarcasm, no mockery. Erica nodded slowly. "Yes, please." The warmth of the cup in her hands felt almost unbearable. She whispered a quiet "Danke," but the woman had already moved on, tending to another group. For a long moment, no one spoke. They ate in silence, the taste of food, strange and distant, the guilt immediate. Outside, the wind stirred the dust again, but the fear had shifted into something else, something more complicated. They had been ready to hate, ready to endure pain. They were not ready for this quiet, orderly kindness that felt heavier than punishment. When breakfast ended, they were led back outside. The sunlight had risen higher, painting everything gold. The camp seemed less like a prison now, though the fences still stood tall and sharp. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the kitchen, and in the distance, laughter drifted from somewhere unseen. Hilda stopped walking and turned to look back at the mess hall. Her voice was low, almost trembling. "What is this place?" she murmured. No one answered her. The others followed the guards toward their quarters, their footsteps uneven, their thoughts tangled. Behind them, the door to the mess hall closed, the sound echoing like a heartbeat in the dry air. The question lingered, unspoken in all of them. If this was captivity, why did it feel so close to peace? And if the enemy could show mercy, what did that say about everything they had once believed? Days in the camp began to settle into a rhythm, the kind that felt both safe and suffocating. Every morning the same bell rang through the dust-heavy air, followed by the steady clatter of trays in the mess hall. The first few mornings, the nurses still hesitated, lining up in silence, their backs straight, waiting for orders that never came. But gradually their steps loosened, their shoulders dropped, and the instinct to brace for cruelty faded, though not completely. Fear doesn't disappear. It just hides beneath the skin. They ate quietly, grateful but uneasy. The food was plain, bread, beans, sometimes eggs, but to stomachs that had survived on ration scraps and watered soup, it was almost too much. They whispered to each other that it couldn't last, that one day the Americans would stop pretending to be kind. Yet every morning the coffee brewed, the bread baked, and the guards remained the same, watchful, distant, but never hateful. The sameness itself became its own kind of comfort. After breakfast came roll call, then chores. Some were assigned to laundry duty, some to the kitchen, some to cleaning the barracks. It was strange how quickly routine began to dull their fear. The sound of brooms on the wooden floor, the hiss of hot water poured into metal basins, even the hum of English voices in the distance, it all became familiar, almost soothing. For the first time in years they could predict what the next hour would bring. No air raids, no sirens, no orders shouted in panic, just work meals and waiting. Letters were allowed once a week. Writing them was both a relief and a burden. Sitting at long wooden tables, with thin paper and stubby pencils, the women tried to compress their new reality into sentences that would pass the censor's black ink. "I am safe," most of them wrote. "We have food. The guards are not cruel." They never wrote about the smell of coffee or the clean sheets. Those details would have sounded like betrayal. Yet even in those cautious words, a strange warmth crept in, a sense of calm they were afraid to admit. At night the barracks filled with murmured conversations. Some whispered about home, about mothers still standing, in breadlines about cities reduced to ash. Others spoke of their confusion, of how captivity could feel less brutal than freedom had become back in Germany. "It's wrong to feel this way," one of them muttered once, her hands twisting in her lap. "We're prisoners. We shouldn't feel grateful." Hilda, lying on her bunk, said nothing. Gratitude had become a dangerous emotion. It felt like treason against everything they'd lost. Still, gratitude lived quietly in small gestures. The way someone shared the last piece of bread. The way an American nurse left a tin of salve on a table without saying a word. These moments blurred the line between enemy and human. The nurses tried to resist it, to remember the stories they'd been told, that Americans were arrogant, ruthless, untrustworthy. But each day contradicted that lesson in ways too simple to deny. The camp had rules, of course. They couldn't wander far from their quarters, and guards were always nearby. Yet within those limits a kind of normal life emerged. They washed their uniforms, braided each other's hair, sewed torn hems with borrowed needles. When they passed the yard, they sometimes saw other prisoners, soldiers, mostly playing soccer or repairing fences. The sight unsettled them. Men they'd expected to see broken and defeated were laughing under the open sky. How could captivity look so ordinary? The sun in Arizona was relentless. By afternoon the air shimmered and heat waves rose from the gravel paths. The nurses sought shade by the barrack walls, fanning themselves with scraps of paper, watching the guards move in their crisp uniforms. There were no beatings, no shouting, just the steady routine of discipline. One of the Americans whistled softly as he walked his post, and for reasons none of them could explain, that small sound filled them with unease. Music shouldn't exist in a prison, they thought. Not here, not now. And yet it did. Erica often found herself listening to the sounds of the camp at dusk. The clang of kitchen pots, the distant hum of a generator, the low murmur of men talking beyond the fence. It reminded her of evenings before the war, when she'd walk home from the hospital and smell bread from the bakeries closing for the night. The familiarity hurt. Every memory of peace now carried guilt. When Sunday came, the camp slowed. Some prisoners attended a service led by a chaplain. Others stayed behind, writing or resting. The nurses joined once, sitting in the back, not understanding the English hymns but recognizing their tone, the longing in the voices, the fragile hope. For a brief moment it didn't matter which side anyone had fought for. Everyone in that wooden hall was just tired of war. Weeks passed. The women no longer flinched when someone shouted across the yard. They began to sleep through the night, their dreams no longer filled with sirens and gunfire, but with quieter, stranger images. Tables full of food, faces they couldn't name, the desert horizon burning gold. And yet beneath the fragile calm unease persisted. They didn't understand why their captors gave them so much or what purpose it served. At times, the smallest things betrayed their confusion. When a guard held a door open, they hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. When an American nurse smiled, they didn't know how to respond. To return, kindness felt dangerous, like crossing an invisible line. The habits of fear were hard to unlearn. One evening after dinner, the sky glowed crimson behind the fences. The air was cooler then, carrying the scent of dry grass and smoke. The nurses sat outside their barracks, watching the light fade. Hilda broke the silence. "Do you think they hate us?" she asked quietly. Erica looked toward the guard tower, where a silhouette stood against the red sky. "If they do," she said, after a long pause, "they hide it well." The words lingered between them, heavy with both comfort and suspicion. Maybe this calm was real. Maybe it wasn't. None of them could tell. What they did know was that the world outside the wire was crumbling, while inside this strange ordered place they were being fed, clothed, and treated like people. It was wrong, and yet it felt like survival. That night Erica lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The barracks were silent, except for the occasional creak of wood as someone turned in their bunk. She thought of the American nurse, the coffee, the sunlight spilling through the fence, the men who guarded them with restraint instead of rage. She thought of everything she'd been taught about strength, about superiority, about the enemy, and how none of it fit anymore. The quiet pressed against her chest until it felt like guilt. As her eyes drifted shut, one thought rose uninvited, carrying both relief and dread. Perhaps mercy was not a sign of weakness after all. Perhaps the world she had believed in had been built on lies. And if that was true, then what else, she wondered, had they all been wrong about? The first time they were led to the infirmary, the air smelled nothing like war. It was sharp, with disinfectant, and soap bright and metallic, like something alive and sterile all at once. The German nurses stood in the doorway, hesitant, their hands clasped behind their backs. Rows of white beds stretched across the room, clean sheets tucked so tight you could bounce a coin off them. Cabinets lined the walls, stacked with bottles and gauze rolls, gleaming metal instruments and glass jars filled with pills. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and cold. For a moment no one moved. It looked like a hospital from another world, a world where the war had never reached. An American nurse with auburn hair noticed them. "You'll work here," she said, her tone even neither friendly nor cruel. "Keep things clean, no shortcuts." She handed each woman a small bundle of towels and pointed toward the sinks. The orders were clear, firm, and fair. The German nurses exchanged glances, unsure if this was punishment or privilege. To touch soap and linen again felt too generous for prisoners. Erica's hands shook as she began scrubbing a basin. The smell of bleach filled her lungs, and with it came a memory bombed out wards back in Hamburg. Wounded soldiers, lying on floors slick with blood, nurses sewing wounds with thread meant for clothes, because medical supplies had run out months before. Here there was order, here the shelves were full. Bottles of penicillin sat in neat rows, like treasure. In Germany they had whispered that word like a prayer, a miracle that only generals could afford. She stared at the labels in disbelief. "How can they have so much?" she murmured in German. Hilda, beside her, said nothing. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the endless supplies. "Maybe they didn't bomb their own factories," she said finally, her voice hollow. The American staff moved with quiet confidence. They didn't gloat, didn't flaunt their abundance, but it surrounded everything they did. They treated the sick with efficiency, even the prisoners, men who had fought against them. A young American medic carried a tray of medicine past Erica and stopped when he saw her watching. "You ever use penicillin?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not once." He smiled faintly, almost apologetically. "We've got more of it than we can count." Then he walked away, leaving her with the weight of that sentence. They worked in silence for hours, washing, folding, cleaning instruments. Every sound in the infirmary was gentle water, running soft footsteps, the clink of metal on glass. There was no shouting, no chaos, no fear. Even the sick men in their beds seemed at peace. The contrast gnawed at Erica's chest. Back home, hospitals had been places of desperation. Here they felt almost holy. At midday they were given a short break. The American nurse Margaret, she said her name was poured water into metal cups and handed them out. When Erica took hers, their fingers brushed for a second. Margaret looked at her directly, her expression calm, unreadable. "Everyone deserves clean hands," she said before moving on. The words were simple, but they struck deeper than any sermon. That night Erica couldn't sleep. The image of those shelves haunted her. She thought of her mother standing in line for bread, of her younger brother scavenging for coal, in the rubble of hospitals, where patients died, not from wounds, but from infection because there was nothing left to fight it with. Here, behind enemy fences, the medicine sat waiting in glass bottles. It felt like an injustice too strange to name. Over the next weeks, they settled into the rhythm of the infirmary. They scrubbed floors, washed linens, sterilized instruments. They began to understand the language of the place, the calm tone of the doctors, the discipline of the nurses, the absence of cruelty. They saw Americans treat their own wounded soldiers, then turn to care for German prisoners without hesitation. No speeches, no humiliation, just the same procedure, the same attention to detail. It was impossible not to notice the fairness of it. One afternoon, Hilda helped change the dressings on a German POW recovering from pneumonia. An American doctor supervised quietly. When the man coughed, the doctor steadied him with one hand, saying, "Easy there, friend." The word stunned her friend. A word that had no place between enemies. Later, as they cleaned up, Hilda asked him, "Why do you call him that?" The doctor glanced up from his clipboard. "Because he's sick," he said simply, "and sickness doesn't wear a uniform." Then he walked away. The sentence echoed in her head all evening. Sickness doesn't wear a uniform. Neither, perhaps, does kindness. Outside, the desert wind howled around the barracks, carrying dust that seeped through the cracks in the walls. The nurses lay awake, each turning that thought over in their minds. If the Americans could care for those who had tried to kill them, what did that mean about everything they had believed? What did that say about the difference between strength and humanity? Days blurred into each other. The fear that had once defined every breath slowly eroded, replaced by something quieter: respect, confusion, and a growing awareness that they were seeing a side of war their leaders had hidden from them. One morning, as Erica entered the infirmary, she caught sight of a delivery truck unloading boxes. She stepped closer and saw what was inside: bandages, gauze, glass bottles, even chocolate bars for the patients. The abundance was dizzying. "It's like it never ends," she whispered. Margaret, standing beside her, nodded. "It doesn't," she said. "Factories keep sending it. We just use what we need." Erica hesitated. "In Germany, we ran out of everything." Margaret looked at her, a trace of sadness in her eyes. "That's what war does when it eats itself." She didn't say more. For the rest of the day, Erica couldn't stop thinking about that phrase, war eating itself. In the quiet hum of the infirmary, surrounded by order and light, she began to see that truth for what it was. War had devoured her country from the inside out. Not just its cities, but its conscience. The realization came slowly, like the soft dawn after a long night. These Americans, with their endless supplies and steady calm, had built something her nation had lost the ability to care even in victory. That evening, as the sun set behind the fences, the light turned the infirmary windows gold. Inside, the women worked in silence, folding clean sheets that smelled faintly of soap and warmth. For the first time, Erica didn't feel like a prisoner doing forced labor. She felt like a nurse again. And with that came a fragile, unsettling thought. She couldn't shake. Maybe mercy was not weakness at all. Maybe it was the greatest power left in a world that had nearly destroyed itself. The letter arrived on a gray morning, its paper thin as breath and edges worn from travel. Erica's name was written in her mother's hand, trembling and faint. The guard handed it to her with a curt nod, and for a moment, she just stared at it, afraid to open it. The last letter she had received from home was months ago, before the surrender, before the silence that followed. Now her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The words were short, but each one cut deep. "We are alive," her mother wrote. "The city is gone. We sleep in the cellar. There is little to eat. Your brother is gone. He did not come back from the front. People trade anything for bread, sometimes even their wedding rings. But we are alive. The ink smudged halfway through as if the pen had run out, or her mother had simply stopped writing. At the bottom was a final line, scrawled and uneven: "Do not worry about us. Be safe." Erica folded the letter carefully, pressing it flat between her palms. Around her, the barracks were quiet, filled with the steady rhythm of women breathing in sleep. She sat there in the half-light, the smell of dust and soap heavy in the air, and felt the words claw through her chest. Her family was starving, her city was ash, and she was sitting here with a full stomach and clean sheets. Shame rose like bile. She thought of the breakfast she had eaten that morning. Bread, beans, a slice of fruit, and it suddenly tasted bitter in her memory. Outside, the bell rang for roll call. She hid the letter under her pillow and followed the others into the yard. The sun was bright, cruelly bright, and she squinted as she took her place in line. The guards called out names, their voices flat and steady. It all felt distant. Every sound in the camp now seemed layered with guilt: the scrape of a boot, the clatter of trays in the mess hall, even the faint hum of laughter from the guards' quarters. How could such ordinary noises exist while her mother dug for food in the ruins? That afternoon in the infirmary, Erica couldn't focus. She scrubbed the same tray twice, her hands raw from the water. Margaret noticed. "You're somewhere else today," she said quietly. Erica hesitated, then whispered, "I got a letter." Margaret's expression softened. "Good news." Erica's throat tightened. "They're alive," she said, "but starving." She looked up at the shelves stacked with medicine, the polished instruments, the linen folded in perfect squares. Her voice cracked. "We have everything here. They have nothing." Margaret didn't answer at first. She set down the clipboard she was holding and leaned against the counter. "War doesn't end all at once," she said. "It takes time for mercy to catch up." Then, after a pause, she added, "You can't feed them from here. But you can remember this." She gestured around the room. "How it feels when people choose decency instead of revenge. Maybe one day you'll take that back with you." That night, Erica couldn't sleep. The sound of the desert wind slipped through the cracks in the barrack walls, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the kitchen fires. It reminded her of home, of the nights in Hamburg, when the sky glowed red from the bombs, and she could taste ash in the air. She pressed the letter to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. The guilt was too heavy to pray away. Across the room, Hilda stirred. "You're awake," she whispered. Erica didn't answer. "You read bad news?" Hilda asked. Erica nodded. "They have nothing left," she said quietly. "And I have too much." Her voice broke. "What kind of justice is this?" Hilda sat up, her silhouette faint in the dark. "It isn't justice," she said. "It's irony." Then she lay back down, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. Maybe that's all that's left when wars end. The next day, the camp received visitors, an inspection team from another base. The nurses were told to keep the infirmary spotless. Erica polished metal trays until she could see her reflection. But the face staring back looked older, thinner, and foreign. When the officers arrived, they walked through the ward, nodding at the orderliness, the cleanliness, the efficiency. One of them said something about America's standards of humanity. Erica caught the words and felt something twist inside her. Humanity. That was the word they had used for their cause, too. Her country had claimed it while burning it to ashes. Later, as she stepped outside for air, the sun hit her face, and she caught sight of a black American soldier repairing a section of the fence. He worked quietly, methodically, sweat tracing lines down his neck. 2 white guards stood nearby, talking casually, not mocking him, not dismissing him. The sight confused her as much as it moved her. Back home, men like him wouldn't have been allowed inside a hospital, let alone to stand as equals. Here he was part of the same uniform, part of the same system that had shown her kindness. It was another crack in the wall of what she thought she knew. That evening she sat alone outside the barracks, watching the sun sink into the desert. The air smelled of dry grass and distant rain. She took the letter from her pocket and read it again, tracing the lines with her fingers. Her mother's words, "We are alive," echoed in her mind. But alive meant different things now. Her family survived in ruin. She survived in comfort. And the enemy, the supposed enemy, had given her that comfort. She looked toward the fence, where the sky turned from orange to purple. The wire glimmered faintly in the fading light, less like a prison and more like a reminder of distance, of difference, of choices. She thought of Margaret's words, "Mercy takes time to catch up." Maybe that was true. Maybe mercy was the only thing left when everything else had been destroyed. A gust of wind lifted the sand and brushed against her skin like a whisper. For the first time, she didn't feel hatred toward the guards or the country that held her. What she felt was harder to name, a quiet, aching respect, and beneath it, the fear of what that respect meant. If the people she had been taught to fear could show such restraint, such order, such humanity, then what did that say about the world she had come from? What did it say about her? The stars began to appear one by one, cold and distant. The camp lights flickered on, throwing long shadows across the ground. Erica stayed there until the others had gone to bed, her letter still in her lap, her thoughts heavy and wide as the desert sky. In the silence, a truth settled over her like a weight she could no longer resist. Perhaps the enemy had not been who she thought. Perhaps the real enemy was everything that had made her believe kindness was impossible. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she didn't see fire. She saw faces, American, German, black, white, all moving through the same fragile light, bound not by nations, but by the quiet, stubborn will to keep something human alive. And when she finally rose to return, inside the letter, slipped from her hands, carried gently by the wind, its paper fluttering against the wire like a ghost refusing to let go. By late summer, the desert air had turned softer and the wind carried less dust. The war was over now, truly over. News drifted through the camp like echoes from another world. Germany divided, cities in ruin, soldiers returning home to nothing. The women no longer counted the days. Time inside the fence had taken on its own shape, one marked not by fear or hunger, but by quiet repetition. Breakfast bells, laundry lines, the hum of voices in languages that no longer felt foreign. Yet something inside them had changed so profoundly that none of them could name it aloud. The enemy had become a mirror showing them everything their own side had destroyed. One morning, Erica stood outside the infirmary, watching the flag rise above the camp. The fabric rippled in the wind, red, white, blue, its colors catching the early light. For months that flag had represented defeat, humiliation, captivity. Now it felt like something else, a symbol of a world that still believed in order when everything else had fallen apart. She didn't love it, but she respected what it meant, the discipline, the restraint, the quiet belief that decency was worth upholding even toward those who had not earned it. That realization frightened her more than any gun ever had. Inside, the infirmary buzzed with its usual rhythm, the smell of antiseptic, the gleam of metal, the soft rustle of clean linen. The nurses worked side by side with Americans, now no longer watched as closely, no longer treated like strangers. There were moments, small and unspoken, when a task passed between hands without distinction. German or American didn't matter. It was work. It was healing. And in that work they began to sense the faint outline of something larger than war itself. Margaret entered with a new supply crate. She caught Erica's glance and smiled faintly. "You'll be going home soon," she said. The words hit harder than expected. Home, what did that even mean? Now Erica nodded, but didn't answer. She thought of the letter she'd lost to the wind, the one that had carried her mother's voice across the ocean. Somewhere out there between rubble and hunger, that word still existed, but it wasn't waiting for her in the same way. Later, as she folded sheets near the window, she noticed a young American soldier sitting outside, his arm in a sling, his face turned toward the horizon. He was no older than her brother had been when he left for the front. For a long moment she watched him, realizing with quiet astonishment that she felt no hatred, no resentment, only sadness. Two young people born into different flags, each taught to fear the other, and neither understanding why. She wondered how many lives could have been spared if someone, somewhere, had chosen mercy sooner. The camp itself had become its own strange reflection of the world fences, dividing yet protecting, guards who enforced rules yet offered kindness, prisoners who obeyed but also rebuilt themselves within those limits. It was as if humanity, shattered by war, had found a small corner to prove it still existed. The paradox haunted her. She began to see the Americans' restraint not as weakness, but as strategy. A kind of moral victory built not on destruction, but on preservation. Where Germany had burned its soul in the name of power, America had weaponized dignity. In the evenings, the desert glowed gold and quiet. The air cooled, the smell of bread and coffee drifted once more from the kitchen. That scent, so ordinary, so human, had followed her since the day she arrived, and it struck her now with new meaning. It wasn't just the smell of food. It was survival, continuity, proof that even after everything, life insisted on existing. She realized how much of war's cruelty came not only from violence, but from the deliberate killing of such small, ordinary mercies. One afternoon, while cleaning instruments, she asked Margaret a question that had been building inside her for months. "Why do you treat us this way?" Margaret paused, looked at her, then said, "Because what we do now is what the world remembers later." She said it simply, without pride, but to Erica it felt like revelation. The Americans weren't just winning battles, they were shaping memory itself. The kindness, the order, the fairness, it wasn't only morality, it was legacy. That night she couldn't stop thinking about those words. What the world remembers later. Maybe that was the true weapon of peace, not power, not fear, but the stories that survive after the fighting ends. She thought of her mother, of her brother, of all the faces erased by war. She thought of the black nurse who had handed her coffee without judgment, the doctor who called a dying man friend, the guards who never raised their voices. Those moments had carved something new inside her, something her homeland's slogans had never managed to reach. Weeks passed, and rumors spread that they would be sent home soon. The women reacted differently, some with relief, others with dread. Hilda confessed one night that she feared freedom more than captivity. "Out there," she said, "everything is gone. Here, at least there is order." No one argued. They all knew what she meant. Going home meant returning to ruin, to hunger, to silence. Leaving the camp meant leaving behind the one place that had shown them the world could still choose compassion. The day before their departure, Erica walked alone to the edge of the yard. The wind was warm, carrying the faint scent of coffee again. She closed her eyes, breathing it in. That same smell had greeted her the morning she arrived, filling her with disbelief and confusion. Now it brought something entirely different, a fragile peace tinged with grief. The fence hummed softly in the wind. Beyond it lay a land that had defeated her nation not only with bombs, but with the quiet strength of mercy. She realized then that humanity itself was a kind of discipline, a decision renewed every day, even when hatred would be easier. That was what the Americans had shown her, whether they meant to or not. Power wasn't just in weapons or victory parades. It was in the choice to remain kind when the world had given every reason not to be. When the trucks came the next morning, the nurses stood in line, each holding a small bag of belongings. The guards checked the list, then opened the gates. Erica turned one last time toward the camp, the flag, the barracks, the faint curl of smoke rising from the kitchen. The scent of coffee drifted once more through the air. It was the same smell that had once made her afraid, and now it made her ache with something close to reverence. As the truck started to move, she looked back through the dust and thought of Margaret's words echoing in her mind. What the world remembers later. Maybe she thought that was the true test of victory, not who conquered, but who remembered how to be human. The camp faded behind them, swallowed by the desert, but its lesson remained quiet and enduring, like the scent of breakfast carried on the wind. She didn't speak for a long time. None of them did. The silence between them was full, not of fear this time, but of something deeper, something fragile and sacred. And as the sun rose over the horizon, she whispered to herself, not in grief, but in wonder. Mercy was never weakness. It was survival. When the war finally faded into history, what remained were not the flags or the ruins, but the memory of what people chose to be when everything else had fallen apart. For those women, captivity had become a paradox. The place meant to confine them had instead freed them from the lies they had carried all their lives. In that quiet Texas or Arizona desert, They learned that dignity could survive, even behind barbed wire, that mercy could exist in the hands of those they had been taught to hate. The smell of bread, the calm of order, the steady rhythm of life inside the camp, all of it became proof that humanity was not owned by any nation or ideology. It could appear in the simplest acts: a cup of coffee, a folded blanket, a word spoken without cruelty. Years later, when they told their grandchildren about those days, they did not speak of defeat or shame. They spoke of the morning light falling on fences, of the way compassion had found them where they least expected it. What they carried home was not the bitterness of loss, but the strange peace of understanding that kindness, even in the smallest form, has the power to outlast war itself. The world changes through choices, like that quiet, unseen, yet impossible to erase. And perhaps that is the lesson history keeps trying to teach us, that mercy is not the opposite of strength, but its truest measure.